Well, this is a much larger turnout than I anticipated. Thank you very much. And a little bit of a disclaimer before we begin because of some of the promotions that I got here. The newspaper article that was written about me seemed to imply that this show is going, or this presentation is going to be more about the supernatural than it is about Native traditions. And in fact, even though I stressed this in the interview, the presentation is much more about Native traditions and is probably much more anthropological than it is about anything supernatural. The reason that we can talk about cryptids and use that term is because the types of relationships that natives had and in some cases still have with beings that they identify as being similar in appearance or affect to beings that are occasionally reported by other people, they don't refer to those things as cryptids. You see, that's a term that we use to describe these beings or these consciousnesses that they have relationships with. So I can talk about cryptids, but I'm not going to be making any claims about whether they are real or not, because I can't. Because even if they are, we have no idea what they are. And so I'm not going to make any kinds of claims about identifying them or anything. In other words, I'm not going to say because natives have had these certain experiences and they've developed certain, or over time developed certain ways of expressing their relationship with these experiences and these beings, that proves that Bigfoot is true, or that proves that a horned serpent is true. I'm not going to say that because I don't know. You know, I wasn't brought up in Native traditions. I've had a few odd experiences, but I can't even make good claims about those in terms of, I don't know what they mean, you know, except that the world is a lot more complicated and interesting than a lot of people would like us to believe. And that's about, and you know that anyway. I mean, that's not like a big secret. And you don't need conspiracies for that, you know, that's just simply the truth about the world. The world, one would hope, is always bigger than we would think that it was. So there is sort of an order to how I'm going to talk about this. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about Native history, which is really important, especially for this area, because some of the rituals that I'm going to be talking about were some of the most important rituals that were engaged in by Native people here, but they're not engaged in anymore. And there are specific reasons for that. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And I'm going to be dealing with two main groups of natives, the two major groups that were here in New York State. One which is broadly called the Algonquin peoples, of which there were several different types on the east and west side of the river. And then more to the north, north of Albany, and then to the western part of the state, the Haudenosaunee, or as we call them, the Iroquois. I try to use Native names as much as I can because I think it's really good practice. And I think it's an important indicator of the fact that many of these people are still here. In fact, many of them have never left. They're around us, they're among us. I know many of them in Ulster County, and they have found ways of accommodating and assimilating to dominant culture without losing much of everything of what they are and what they were. So it's partly out of respect for them that I try to do that, even though I will apologize for my pronunciation on occasion. So I will be focusing mostly on three main types of what are, I guess we would call cryptids. The first being Bigfoot type creatures, I guess, and the reason I call them Bigfoot type creatures is because that's what they most look like. Or that's, you know, there are some natives that have actually claimed that, in fact, what people are experiencing when they see such things is a manifestation of what we'll be talking about. Other natives will deny that entirely. In fact, I've run into some natives that say, oh no, white people brought these with them. So natives are not themselves agreed necessarily on what white folks experience. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about that from the Algonquin tradition, and then a little bit about what are called horned serpents from the Algonquin tradition, and a little bit about the little people, which are all of the New York traditions talk about the little people. I mean, that's something that's ubiquitous. Everybody talks about the little people. Lots of types of little people too. And then I will segue from I'll talk about those, and then when I talk about the horned serpents, I will segue from Algonquin culture into Haudenosaunee culture and talk a little bit about what they do with some of these very same things, or what seem to be very similar things. And then I'll wrap up by talking about monsters, because monsters are cool. Although in the native tradition, monsters are scary. You know, they're quite scary, actually. So first, let's sort of get ourselves settled here. This sounds like a lot, but I figured out how to do it pretty quick. This, of course, is the whole area that is called the Eastern Woodlands tradition. And there were lots of different groups of people who lived in this area, right here. The vast majority who lived in the Northeast were of two groups. The Algonquins, who are considered to be, and that's basically a language family. And they are considered to be the oldest native group that first settled in this area. Although according to their traditions, when they settled in this area, there were people here before them, which they sort of hint at. And of course, we don't really know who they were. And then there are the Haudenosaunee, and of course, you are probably familiar with them. They were across the northern tier of the state. These two groups of people were organized quite differently, especially by the time of contact. The Algonquin peoples tended to live in smaller communities. They tended to be a little bit more nomadic. In fact, I think that they are characterized as being semi-sedentary, even though they did have agriculture. And some groups were more nomadic than others, so there was a high variation. But they were all, especially in this area, they were all similar in that they spoke dialects of the same language. And they had roughly the same customs and culture. So they could sort of understand what everybody else was doing, all right? The Haudenosaunee are of a completely different language family. In fact, they are related to the Cherokee, who are quite far south. They are of the same language family. And they developed a more highly centralized form of government, especially by the time of contact. It's considered to be one of the oldest and most original democratic republican governments in the world. And you may have heard of it. It was called the Great Law of Peace. It still is called the Great Law of Peace. It still exists, actually, as a distinct polity, joining the Haudenosaunee people in Canada and in America. They pay no attention, or as little attention as they have to the boundary between those two countries. All right. So what we're talking about are two groups of people who shared a lot of the same kinds of topography. They both had agriculture. They used it in different ways. They both shared the same basic landscape. So you're going to find that there are some similarities between the two groups in terms of how they see the relationship to these beings and how they describe them. So if you're talking about the Hudson Valley specifically, this of course is the river right here, because I don't know how far back you can see this. This is the river. This is Esopus right here. So the approximate location of Esopus Township. This is just north of Saugerties, right up in this area here. And this of course runs into New Jersey, parts of Pennsylvania, down into parts of Delaware. This whole area was considered to be Lenape land, essentially. And who the Lenape were was a distinctive dialect group of the Algonquin people. And these dialects were further divided into some specific dialect I guess you would call them clans or tribes. And on the eastern side of the river, up where we are, the group that was here were called the Wappingers. And their territory ran all the way up to, well, you can see Connecticut here, so it ran all the way up to the northern boundary here. And then where Kingston is, those were the Esopus natives, and they were part of a larger group here that were called the Munsee. And if you're interested in knowing more about these groups specifically, well, there are lots of wonderful histories that have been written about them, including an historian, Evan Pritchard, who's done quite a good job at putting together some of their traditions. All of these peoples here shared a basic culture and a basic understanding of how life should be lived. The reason this is important is as you go through the stories and as you go through as I'll go through the slide, you'll notice that names change. So that by the late 18th century, most of the Munsee and many of the Wappingers had actually been pushed west as they were fleeing from colonialization. And the first place that they settled was right around here, the Delaware region, that Delaware River, and that's where they became known as the Delaware Indians. And they started their trek, the people that are now called the Delaware, that were the Lenape. This was the beginning of their trek that would lead them from this area all the way to the Ohio Valley, where they would join forces with the Shawnee. And then they would be pushed even further west into Indiana, where they would found the city that is now called Muncie. And then they would be pushed west again into Kansas. And part of my interest in this is because my grandfather had a farm that had been carved out of original patents that had been given to the Delaware when they were pushed in this area. And in fact, there's a creek in Kansas that's called Delaware Creek for the natives that were pushed into this area. And finally, right before the Civil War, and right before and after, they were pushed one last time and forced to move to Oklahoma. So that was sort of all the things that happened to the people that started out living here. They took with them their traditions, including the tradition of Missingwe, which is what I'm going to tell you about now. I can make this stuff. There. This is taken from a huge book on the Delaware and Muncie that I have, which if you're interested in getting a copy of it, you have to pay $70 just to the author to get it. And it's considered one of the most authoritative texts on the Muncie, Delaware. But this is Nora Thompson, who was one of the last surviving Missingwe singers in Oklahoma. And she is showing an old Missingwe mask. Now, who Missingwe was, that's how you spell his name, who Missingwe he was understood to be a guardian of the forest. And there's a story that the Delaware told about how Missingwe first appeared to the people and gave them their most important ritual. And in this story, there were three. It was during a time when the Lenape were in the east. They talk about that, when they lived in the east. And it was a time of great famine. And they don't really describe exactly what had happened, but the people had fallen away from their beliefs and from their traditions. And there were these three young boys that had kind of been abandoned by their family. And they went out into the woods. And they were approached by this being who identified itself as Missingwe. And Missingwe, the word means living solid face. And one of the boys was picked up by this being and taken away into the sky to the place where he came from and was taught all of these rituals and then brought back. and sent with his friends and then sent home. Well, the people wouldn't listen at first to these boys. And so they got discouraged and they went back out in the woods and they tried to call Masingwe and say, you know, nobody's listening to us. And so Masingwe said, hey, I will come with you and I will show them that I am real and I will give you these traditions. And so the tradition that Masingwe was said to have given these people, the Lenape people, was called the Great House Ceremony, or the Tsinkwakan. Yeah, the Tsinkwakan. There we go. And the purpose of the Tsinkwakan was to bring all the people together. And the first thing you were supposed to do when you celebrated the Tsinkwakan is that you were to go into the forest and carve a Masingwe mask out of a living tree. Carve it into the tree and then peel it off and make a mask and paint half of it black and half of it white. And that would be sort of like the beginning of the ritual. And then after that you were to create a special lodge and have 12 posts in the lodge upon which there would be a little tiny mask of Masingwe that would be placed in all of the 4 directions. And the ritual was to last for 12 days, and it was to involve all the people of all the villages. So it was like, it happened in the fall, it was like a harvest festival, and all the people from all the clans and all the villages would come, and they would all be organized in a certain way in the lodge. And the purpose of this was so that everyone had a chance to tell of all their visions and dreams. And then after that happened, then there was a special ritual that was done to call Masingwe. And the reason why you called Masingwe was to ensure that good hunting would happen and to affirm your relationship to Masingwe when Masingwe appeared. And it was said that he always appeared. And he would signal his appearance with loud hooting sounds and wood knocks. That will sound familiar to some of you. And occasionally would leave a single footprint in order to mark his passing. But according to natives, this was not an impersonator. This was a real being. And in order to signal, if you were a hunter, in order to signal your relationship to Masingwe, before you went out hunting, before you went into the forest, before you did anything with the woods, you would put offerings of tobacco down in order to let Masingwe know that you were acknowledging a relationship with him. If you didn't do that, your hunt wouldn't work. All of the animals would run and hide. Okay? So this is roughly what these large lodges would look like here. And this is a representation of what the painted mask might have looked like. There are no great houses that exist anymore. The last great house ceremony was conducted in 1924 in Oklahoma because there wasn't anyone after Nora Thompson that remembered the songs anymore. And as with most natives, it's very important that oral tradition be part of this. So if the last person dies, it dies. There are some Delaware who are hoping that they can bring it back, but there's no consensus. And it's considered to be a larger community thing. So all the Delaware pretty much have to agree to do this before it can be done. And then, of course, it would have to be reconstituted in some way. And they know that. They know it would have to be reconstituted. This is a specific rattle. This is the rattle. In the east here, this turtle would be the painted turtle, which is considered to be a very, very holy turtle to the Munsee in particular and to the Wappinger people. Now, obviously, as they moved west, they would use other turtles as they could find them. As this ritual moved, as the Delaware were displaced and the ritual moved west, the ritual itself began to change. And when they met up with the Shawnee in the Ohio Valley, they found that the Shawnee had some similar rituals. They weren't identical, but they were similar. One of the differences was the relationship that Masingwe, who they pronounce a little bit differently, had with the people. He was more of a trickster character. And what he would do is he would, and there were impersonators that would dress in bearskins with a slightly different type of mask, and they would, during times of, I guess, community turmoil, they would jump out and scare people and try to convince people to do the right thing and to get back into touch with nature and to remind people. They were also used to scare kids into good behavior. And apparently, and this is what this picture is actually found. This picture found it very interesting. This is showing a Masingwe impersonator jumping out at a white person and scaring them away from Shawnee territory. But what was interesting was that was not how this picture was labeled. This picture was labeled as something like Indian dancer, in a source that had no idea that this is a Masingwe mask and this is a Masingwe rattle. And I noticed it and I was like, somebody doesn't know what they're looking at. But it was a book about Shawnee stuff. And this is probably one of the last Masingwe dancers in Oklahoma. The point, of course, of this is that Masingwe was a being that was associated with this area that would appear under certain circumstances for some people and was responsible for helping to maintain a relationship with people in the forest. That was the point of this being. The natives did not go off in search of it. They did not try to get photos of it. They did not try to convince themselves of its reality. They just simply accepted that there was something there that they were to have a relationship with in order to guarantee that they would have food in the winter, specifically. And then this is the last great house that was in in Oklahoma. And you can see that it's not, when this picture was taken, it is not in good repair. Originally, the great houses were temporary structures. But as the Delaware moved, they sought to create more permanent structures, partly because of the difference in the vegetation, and partly because it was an attempt to settle down somewhere. It was also true that some of the other natives, like the Wappingers, for example, and the Shawnee, also tended to have more permanent structures for their versions of this. And ironically, perhaps, the woman who is the founder of the Bigfoot research group here in the Hudson Valley, her house sits on the plot that originally held one of the Central Wappinger Great Lodges, which I find to be rather interesting, kind of an odd coincidence. So if you can't, I don't know if you can see this, but these are the posts. They have the masks here. One of the things that Masingwe instructed the people to do was even create drumsticks with his face on it. So this is a medicine bundle. These things have still survived, I believe, here at the University in Oklahoma, where they have a very large exhibition of native stuff. Now, what did Masingwe look like? Well, he actually was supposed to look sort of like this. This is actually a statue, a famous statue in Whitehall, New York, where Bigfoot is supposedly seen. And yeah, Masingwe did sort of look like that. Big, tall, hairy guy. When people saw him, I'm not saying he was Sasquatch. I have absolutely no idea. I don't know what Sasquatch is, all right? But the native sources basically do agree that if you saw him directly, this is what you'd see. Now, I have included some photos from the internet. I have no way of proving anything about the veracity of these photos. They could all be hoaxes, okay? But I put them up just to indicate that there are people that are still seeing these things. And this is an alleged trail cam photo of something near Whitehall, New York. which I guess they're supposed to be getting their own movie here soon, a documentary or something about what has been seen there. And it looks like, I don't know if you can see it, it looks like something kind of leaning over with a big head here. Of course, I have no idea what this is. And Masingwe is still considered important enough that he appears on the seal of the Delaware Lenape people to this day. So they remember him. They just don't know exactly what kind of relationship to have there anymore, you see. Now, a being that often traveled with Masingwe, the Wappingers called Pukwudgij, it's a great word, Pukwudgij, and the Munsee called something like Wemetakanis. And this is the little people. And the knocks that you heard, according to the Lenape I've spoken to, the knocks that you would hear were not actually Masingwe making those knocks, but were Pukwudgij, who would always accompany Masingwe wherever he went. They would ride on the back of the deer and herd them down the deer trails and knock on wood, just to signal their passage, if you will. I don't know of a single native group in the Americas that does not believe in the little people. All right. Now, there are different types of little people. Not all little people are good. And to the Munsee and the Wappingers and the Mohicans, the little people were in charge of vegetation. So if Masingwe was in charge of the animals, Pukwudgij was in charge of the vegetation. And if you made a deal with Masingwe, you were also making a deal with the Pukwudgij. But you needed to be nice. You needed to respect everybody, because if you weren't respectful in your hunting, and all of the deer disappeared, it was because the Pukwudgij had ridden them off. They were taking them away, right? And there were also, depending on where you were in New York State, there were different places where Pukwudgij hung out, and you didn't necessarily want to be with them. There were some like really bad Pukwudgij. In fact, as you go up towards the St. Lawrence River, according to the Algonquin that live up in that area, there's a group of Pukwudgij that are called the spreaders, and you do not want to be around them because they will actually abduct you and kill you, and you will never be seen again. So not all little people are good at all. So it's important to know that when you go out into the woods, and make sure that you always are polite and say hello. Make sure that I'm going here. Okay, right. The only thing that I know of for sure that the Munsee did that might be associated ceremonially, that might be associated with the Pukwudgij, was there was a ritual that they did called the doll ceremony. And the doll ceremony had a story behind it that, there's several versions of it, but basically there were only some families that were picked out to have a relationship with beings, small beings that were associated with doll figures. And they were to feed these doll figures at particular times in order to ensure that Mother Corn, or Tsaksqueen is the name for Mother Corn, to make sure that she paid attention to your entreaties for a good crop. And only certain families did this, not everybody did this. And so this may be somewhat related to a relationship to the Pukwudgij. I haven't been able to determine that exactly. And then the final larger, oh, I needed to show you this, because this is creepy. This is a photo, an alleged trail cam of a native girl or a little person and a deer. And it was just simply uploaded without comment in a paranormal channel on YouTube. I cannot speak for its veracity. I have no idea at all. I have no idea. I mean, this could just be like a little doll over here, right? I have no idea. What I think is interesting is its juxtaposition to a deer. I have no idea what this is.
A feeder.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I didn't even recognize what it is.
It's a deer feeder.
But in any case, that would be about the relative size, actually, that most Pukwudgij were envisioned as. We tend to think of them as being like really, really tiny. They were actually about this tall, at least according to the reports that I've seen. And the last of the particular categories is what the Munsee called Nixoxcook, or the horned serpents. You find stories about horned serpents everywhere in native tradition in North America. I mean, everywhere. It's one of the most ubiquitous types of stories. This is actually a petroglyph from the Southwest, because there aren't a lot of physical representations of serpents in this area, although there are some people who have pointed out forms like this as being potential petroforms, because Algonquin people did create sometimes what are called petroforms, where they take piles of rocks and they sort of make rough shapes with them. And so they're known to do that. But horned serpents were believed to inhabit all bodies of water. So the Hudson River would have one, at least one. All of the Great Lakes would have one, all the Finger Lakes would have one. In fact, so there are certain Finger Lakes like Seneca Lake that are specifically known for sightings that people have had of things there. Obviously, Lake Champlain is known for people seeing things there. And horned serpents were understood to be just simply part of the landscape. They were understood usually, at least by Algonquin people, to be potentially very negative to people. And this is not because they were evil or bad, but because they were just dangerous and they were a different kind of being. You know, but if you could befriend one, they would have really, really good healing magic. Extraordinary healing magic. Now, the Delaware also made a distinction between horned serpents and another type of being that they called water manitous. Water manitous Manitou is basically the term that's used for any good spirit. Okay? And a bad spirit is sometimes called a mantantu. The problem with water manitous is that if you just look at them, they kind of look snaky too. If you see one, they kind of look snaky. So of course the issue is, how do you tell the difference between a horned serpent and a water manitou? You know, a bad guy and a good guy. Well, one of the things I was told is that a water manitou will never disguise its appearance. It will appear to you as kind of a being of light that has a serpentine appearance. Whereas a horned serpent, if it wants your attention, it will appear like a beautiful man or woman to entice you. It's a shapeshifter. It will change its appearance so as to entice you into its lair, so to speak. So this is a Delaware medicine bundle that involved water manitou medicine for rain. And it had within it mica, the mineral mica, that comes in those layers. Those were understood to be like scales of the reptile. So that was one of the things that horned serpents or manitous could give you. Medicine for rain, medicine for healing. That's what they were particularly known for. And of course, these are famous photos taken in Lake Champlain. And let's see here. This photo was taken by a woman named Sandra Mancy in 1977, and it's probably one of the most famous pictures of something coming out of Lake Champlain. Again, I have absolutely no idea whether that's real or true or not. Now, at this point, what I'll do is make a little segue and start talking about the Haudenosaunee, because the Haudenosaunee have all kinds of stories about the horned serpents, because of course they live up there by the Finger Lakes and the Great Lakes. So they have all kinds of stories about the appearance of these giant beings. And this, by the way, is not a word. This is a fake word. It means snake, illness, sort of, or compulsion. And one of the things they said, what they still say in their stories, is that one of the ways in which you can tell that someone has been bewitched by a horned serpent is that they become obsessed with things. They will become obsessed with the supernatural. They will become obsessed with UFOs. They will become obsessed with negative stuff. And that's understood to be a kind of illness, actually, which is kind of interesting. And they have all kinds of stories of young women and young men being enticed by horned serpents to come and live in the underwater areas to be married, Now, it is possible to be liberated if this happens to you, but you have to depend on the intervention of another group of supernatural beings called the Thunderers. And both the Algonquin peoples and the Haudenosaunee believe that the Thunderers are the principal enemies of the horned serpents. And the main one of these, a guy named Hinu, or Hino, I've heard it pronounced in different ways, lives underneath Niagara Falls and is responsible for the roar. This is a reported Lake Ontario serpent. I mean, it might interest you to know that people still see this from time to time. They just don't report it in the news. Right now, Ontario is having huge UFO flaps. I mean, I've been following them now for about 2 or 3 years. They've been seeing it on both sides, both the US and Canadian sides. And I had an experience with Lake Ontario actually a year ago when I came back from the holidays in the Midwest, and I was on a train. I took the train and we went through the northern route, and as we got in between, Buffalo and Rochester, we got stuck in a blizzard. We were stuck in a train on the tracks in a blizzard, and we were right at a place where you could actually see Lake Ontario in the distance, like from horizon to horizon, this huge, roiling, black, green thing being whipped up by the wind and the ice. And I remember looking at that and going, wow, that's a horned serpent. I can kind of grok what they were seeing, really amazing. And this is just a picture of Henu. Jesse Cornplanter is actually a famous artist and medicine man from the 1950s of the Haudenosaunee. And he's drawing a picture here of Henu, who lives under Niagara Falls, smiting people generally because they've become obsessed with horned serpent magic. Now, the Haudenosaunee also maintain relationships with beings that are similar to Masingwe. They don't call them that, though. And where you see this exhibiting itself is in what are called the false face societies. The false face societies are healing orders among the Haudenosaunee. And there are literally dozens of these healing orders and hundreds of these types of masks. But one of the most important masks is this mask right here, which should look a little bit similar. The split, black and red. And his name, if I can pronounce it, is Deho Deat Geowe, which means split face. And he is understood to be a guardian of the forest. And he's treated in much the same way as Masingwe is. The difference is he's considered to be only one of a number of different types of beings. And he's good for healing, but the most important thing with him is that it's very important that you regularly feed him sweet corn hominy mush, because he really likes that. So it's like you put the tobacco at the forest, and you put this hominy mush at the forest, and he really likes that, and that will make everything good. Okay. Now these masks are considered to be living beings. They are carved out of living wood in the same way that the Masingwe masks are. And each design is a little bit different because each person does it in a vision as a result of a vision quest. And so even though there are categories of them, each one is completely distinct and completely unique. And they're supposed to be decommissioned, so to speak, before they're given to white people, but that doesn't always happen. And in fact, there's a famous story about, some of you may be aware of the fact that on March 29th, 1911, the highly vaunted New York State Library in Albany burned. It was located on the 4th floor of the Capitol building at the time, and it was a treasure trove of all kinds of, it was basically, if you want to put it this way, it was sort of like the Alexandria Library of New York history. And it contained within it a huge cabinet that was full of these false face masks that, according to the Haudenosaunee, had been taken from them, had not been purchased, had just sort of been obtained. And they were put in this cabinet along with everything else and just left there and not paid any attention to and not cleaned, not respected. And so on March 29th, 1911, a fire started, which destroyed actually really valuable things. So any of you who decide to do any historical work into the history of your family or the history of certain parts of New York State, you will run up against the impasse of 1911 because unknown things were destroyed in that fire. But one of the things that survived completely untouched was this cabinet of these false face masks, which of course for the Haudenosaunee means, guess who started the fire? In order to make a point. Those masks, by the way, most of them have been returned. The Haudenosaunee also believe in the little people, and they believe there's a particular false face society that is called the Husk Face Society, and they have a particular kind of mask, and they represent the little people. Those are very specifically the little people. Now we're going to get into some monsters. In addition to these three categories of being that you were to have relationships with, either by cultivating them or avoiding them, there were understood by both the Haudenosaunee and the Algonquin people to be a number of other types of beings, most of whom were scary, really scary, and that you were to avoid at any cost. We would, I guess, one of a better word, you'd call these demons. And for the Haudenosaunee, one of these groups, what they called the cannibal stone giants. And according to the Haudenosaunee, these were actually an original group of people who lived here, an original set of beings who lived here. They were like the first hominid inhabitants, if you will, of this area. And they didn't like people at all, didn't like humans, and so they would hunt us, just like we were prey, because, well, you know, they're a lot bigger than us anyway. And they were covered, the reason they were called stone giants is that their skin was really hard, and they were covered with some kind of a, you know, the stories don't say whether it was a kind of armor or a kind of just their skin was hard. But they would actually hunt human beings down and kill them. And so there have been some people who have speculated that maybe when people see really large Bigfoot, maybe they are talking about stone giants. So this is actually taken from a newscast in which they were talking about the Whitehall Sasquatch sightings, and they were referencing the stone giants, essentially, as being a possibility of what people were seeing. The stone giants are very, very similar to a group of beings that the Algonquins refer to as the Chenoo. Here they're called naked bear. And the word they use for that, I've never been able to pronounce. But the naked bear is almost exactly like the Chenoo, which is what the Micmac in Maine refer to. And if you're familiar at all with the Ojibwe and what they call the Wendigo, these are all really similar beings. They are understood to be beings that are produced, in fact, many of them were understood to originally have been humans. And they are produced by murder and secret crimes, the breaking of all taboos, and it turns these people into vampires, essentially, a kind of vampire, super vampire, if you will. And they could also be the results of a curse, essentially. Here, I'll show you this in just a minute. I'll go back. Chenus and Wendigos are to be specifically avoided, and they tend to show up. They tend to show up in winter months or with people who are hunting or by themselves. And in fact, one of my favorite stories is a Micmac story about the Chenoo. And in this story, there's a woman and her two brothers, and they've gone hunting. And the two guys go off to hunt, and the woman stays behind, and she's preparing the food, preparing acorns, doing whatever it is she's doing. And there's a Chenu who realizes that there's a vulnerable female all by herself in the woods. So he begins to hunt her. And at a certain point, she realizes that she's being hunted by a Chenu. So she goes into the hut, and she waits for the Chenu to come to the door. And when he comes to the door, he's this big hulking thing with claws and nasty and skulls adorning his neck. And she turns around and she goes, "Grandfather, it's been so long since I've seen you." And the Chenu's like, "What? Am I somebody's grandfather? Completely confused. She welcomes him in. She feeds him some dinner. She has a sweat lodge all set up. She says, "Why don't you go take a sweat, and I'll just prepare you more food." And in the meantime, her brothers are coming home, and they realize they see the footprints of a Chenu, and they're like, "Oh my God, sister is being attacked and eaten by a Chenu." So they make it to the hut, and they see their sister in there, and they're like, "Where's the Chenu?" And she's like, He's in the sweat lodge. Shh, shh. Just follow my lead." So they're like, "Okay." So the Chenu opens the door of the sweat lodge and moans and says, "I'm still hungry." And she goes, "Okay, grandfather, I'll get you more food." He's our grandfather. Okay, just say he's our grandfather. So they all play along. And this goes on for a while. They keep feeding him and letting him sweat in the sweat lodge. And all of a sudden, they hear a cry. And like a popping sound. And the door opens, and what comes out is this little tiny man. And he's coughed up an ice-cold heart that was the heart of his curse and his crime. And they take him, and they take it, and they dispose of this heart, and they embrace him and bring him home, and he lives with them as just a little old adopted grandfather. So what causes the Chenu is resentment and anger and isolation and hatred. And this can cause terrible things, according to natives. Let me go ahead and go back and show you some of the other things we missed here. I'm having trouble with this cursor that is going all over the place here.
There you go.
There we go. A couple of other demons, or demon-like figures. One, of course, is, there we go. Occasionally people report seeing huge birds. Sometimes they're associated with the thunderer, sometimes they're not. We do know that there was a large bird species that once lived in the area that is now New York. Most scientists believe that probably what happened is that natives found skeletons of it, fossilized remains of it, and drew their own conclusions. But people still occasionally see really large birds. And this particular photo was uploaded, I don't know if you can see it right here, in 1999 of a guy who saw a very large winged creature in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is sort of known for having big bird sightings. And these are birds that are not necessarily like pterodactyls. They're just like really large birds. Or really large bats. Really, like, would fill most of, their wingspan would fill most of this room, essentially. This is also a creature that has been seen a lot. Its most recent sighting in 1909. The Jersey Devil in New Jersey. The place where this was seen in Pine Barrens was known by the Lenape as, they called it the place of the devil. And in fact, Pine Barrens was built on an area that the Lenape regarded as cursed land. so who knows, maybe that's part of it. What is interesting is when I went back and looked at some old records, I found that there was folklore that existed in Manhattan dating from the Dutch period, that when the area that is now around Wall Street was first colonized, and what the Dutch did, the reason they called it Wall Street, was what the Dutch did was build a stockade barricade around the area, a wall, in order to keep basically the natives and then later the British out, so they can control the trading. That's why they called it Wall Street. Well, in order to guard it, they would have sentries guarding it. And according to a number of fairly interesting stories, there were times when the sentries actually saw beings very much like this, scaring them away from their posts. And in fact, one of these stories, there's this great book called Spooky New York that actually tells the story of one of these sentries, which is where I found the reference. And then another one of my favorite monsters, the flying head. And this is Haudenosaunee specifically. Its character is very much like a Chenu in the sense that it's created in the same way, out of secret murder, especially if you murder your kin. But it's basically just a head with wings and legs, and it flies around. Some people have tried to identify it with like tornadoes or with the occasional hurricane winds that will blow in here. But there are actually some very specific stories about the flying head, and one of them is that this is actually depicting a very famous story. A woman was sitting alone again in her hut, parching acorns. And the flying head saw her and decided when he wanted to eat her. Well, flying heads, they never come in the front door. What they do is they fly up to your roof and they come in through the hole at the top. They didn't have chimneys. They just had fire holes, you know, and they come in. And so this flying head gets up on her roof and looks down and sees she's parching these acorns and finds this really interesting that this human is working with fire. So, and is not afraid of fire at all, because flying heads are terrified of fire. So the flying head decided, well, fire must not be such a bad thing after all, and so swooped down and snapped up the parched acorns and the coals, and of course burned its mouth, and shot out the front door screaming the whole time, you know, and that's how the woman parching acorns got rid of the flying head. This is another picture by Jesse Cornplanter. He was interpreting the flying head as being connected to the spirit of a hurricane. So that's been one possible explanation for it. I don't know how well you can see this, the flying head has become something of an image in some video games. There are people that have actually used this because it's such a scary kind of looking critter. And so these are some pictures that an artist drew to include in a video game of the flying head. And I showed you that. And this is an alleged trail cam mystery creature from Louisiana, who some people claim is a Wendigo of some type, although they don't really have Wendigos by name in Louisiana. I have no idea what it is. It could be a hoax. I thought it looked really creepy, so I thought I would put it there. because this is what Wendigos are supposed to look like. And in fact, if you want to read a pretty creepy story about a Wendigo, there's a very well-known story called The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. Classic story. You can Google it, and it's available, free on the internet. You don't have to purchase it. It's a short story. It was written at the turn of the 20th century. And it's written sort of like in the vein of Edgar Allan Poe, horror fiction. But everything in it is taken directly from native tradition. And it is a creepy story. I mean, seriously. It's like one of those stories that you read it and you kind of like, why did I do this at 11? According to both the Algonquin people and the Haudenosaunee people, the way to keep the bad guys at bay and the way to keep in good relationship with the good guys is just to practice what the Haudenosaunee call orenda, or what in Munsee you could term gunt-katehana, good heart. Maintain good heart, gratefulness, relationship, and you can keep the baddies away. And it's really that simple. So for me, what this presentation is really about is it's a call to reestablish relationships with the earth and with whatever beings are here. I don't care what they are. I don't care what you call them. I mean, most people are not even familiar with the regular animals and plants that are hanging out with them all the time. And they're beings too, at least according to natives. If you don't take anything else away from this, understand that for natives, and this is as true now as it was before colonialization, they regarded these beings as part of the landscape. They weren't supernatural. If it exists, it's not paranormal. It's just something we don't understand yet. And so the most important thing you can do is try to be in relationship with it. As good relationship as you can be. If you need to avoid it like a horned serpent, you do so not because it's evil, but because it's dangerous to you personally. You know, most natives didn't have the idea of good and bad, or bad and evil. You know, good and evil in the stark ways that we do. What made a Wendigo evil was because it was cursed, but that curse could be lifted. So, you know, it wasn't anything that was bad or unnatural. So what I tell people is, hey, you know, you don't necessarily need to go out and look for Bigfoot. If you find Bigfoot, great. But go out and find your foxes and find your deer and find your animals and, you know, find the people that live around you. And by people, I don't mean human people. You find the other people that live around you. You know. And then if somebody else decides to show up, well, then you'll realize, oh, this is just part of it. So anyway, that's all that I have.